The coach, the artist, and the businessman. Why is everyone talking about their scandal? Carla Grayson, a successful fitness coach, always strived to find the perfect balance between his career and personal life. His wife, Laura, a charming artist, brought her canvases to life with her paintings. Their relationship seemed perfect, but recent tensions in communication made Carla wonder if everything was as smooth as it seemed. One day, after a long and challenging workday, Carl received an unexpected invitation from his friend Alex, a successful entrepreneur. Alex was hosting a private gathering at his luxurious villa, promising an unforgettable evening. Carl couldn't refuse. He needed a distraction, and Laura, immersed in creating a new collection for an upcoming exhibition, had no objections. At the party, Carl felt slightly out of place. Among the guests, he noticed several celebrities, influential businesspeople, and even politicians. Alex, always charismatic and confident, moved among his guests like the host of another world. However, what impressed Carl the most was a woman who arrived later than everyone else. Her name was Sophie, a young and extraordinarily attractive artist with international acclaim. "You have to meet her," Alex insisted when he noticed Carl glancing in her direction. "She's a real gem. Laura would surely admire her work." Carl couldn't resist the opportunity. Their conversation started casually, but the longer they talked, the more Carl realized that there was something deeper developing between them than just a mutual interest in art. Meanwhile, Laura was at home finishing another painting when she received a message. It came from an unknown number and contained only one photo. Carl and Sophie engrossed in conversation, their gazes betraying something more than mere friendly interest. Laura stared at her phone screen as if trying to rationalize what she saw. In the photo, Carl, her husband, stood next to a woman who seemed both unattainable and dangerous. Her expressive eyes exuded confidence, and her smile hinted at something far beyond a simple friendly chat. Who is she? Laura wondered, trying to resist the immediate wave of jealousy. Her heart pounded, but instead of calling Carl and demanding answers, she decided to act cautiously. She saved the photo from the unknown number and began her search. Sophie Martinez, a young artist who had rapidly gained popularity on the international stage. Her works sold for tens of thousands of dollars, and prestigious art publications often wrote about her. Like any artist, Laura knew her name but never imagined this woman would enter her life in such an unexpected way. Laura spent the next few hours scrolling through Sophie's social media profiles. She saw dozens of photos of Sophie posing in expensive galleries, at exhibitions, and at social events. But one detail immediately caught Laura's eye. On several recent photos, a familiar bracelet appeared. A bracelet Carl had worn for years as a gift from Laura. The discovery struck her like lightning. She understood she needed to stay rational, but the growing sense of betrayal within her was unstoppable. "Hello, Emma?" Laura called her friend, who worked at a gallery. "Hi, Laura. What's going on? I need to find out something. Do you have contacts for the organizers of Alex's event? I need all the information about the guests." Emma hesitated, but eventually agreed. To help, Laura knew she couldn't stop now. She needed answers. The next day, Laura received the guest list for the party. Sophie's name was on it, as well as Carl's. But what shocked her the most was another detail. Sophie lived in a luxurious house only a few miles away from her and Carl's home. Laura decided not to waste time. She drove to the address listed as Sophie's residence and stayed in her car, observing. After an hour, she saw Carl leaving the house, adjusting his suit. Laura's heart sank. That evening, Laura acted as if nothing had happened. Carl, too, didn't seem inclined to share anything. "How was the party?" she asked, maintaining a calm tone. "Oh, it was great," Carl replied, avoiding eye contact. Alex always knows how to surprise. But his casual demeanor only fueled Laura's determination. "And what about Sophie Martinez?" Her voice was cold but emotionless. Carl froze, clearly caught off guard. "Sophie," he tried to smile. "We met. She's talented." "I think so too." Laura looked him straight in the eye. "Especially when she's wearing your bracelet." Carl turned pale. His hands tensed into fists, then relaxed, as if he was trying to hold back words that might reveal too much. "Laura, you've misunderstood everything. It's all a coincidence. But Laura wasn't convinced. The storm brewing inside her wasn't about to dissipate so easily. Laura knew that listening to excuses any further would be pointless. She needed evidence. That night, while Carl was sleeping, Laura took his phone. She knew this could mark the beginning of the end of their relationship, but she couldn't stay in the dark. In the Messenger app, she found messages from Sophie. The most recent one read, "Thank you for a wonderful evening. I can't wait for our next meeting." Laura's eyes filled with tears, but she forced herself to scroll up, hoping to find some indication that it was just friendly communication. However, the words she read only confirmed her worst fears. Laura sat in her car outside the massive gates leading to Sophie's modern estate. She tried to calm herself, but her heart pounded as if it might burst from her chest. She didn't know exactly how this conversation would go, but she knew she needed answers. Laura pressed the intercom button. After a few seconds, Sophie's melodic voice came through the speaker. "Who is it?" "Laura Grayson. We need to talk." A brief pause followed. Laura thought Sophie might refuse to let her in, but moments later, the gates began to open slowly. Taking a deep breath, Laura drove up to the entrance. Sophie greeted her in a spacious, elegant foyer. She was dressed in a simple yet sophisticated dress that reflected her impeccable taste. Her calm demeanor only fueled Laura's anger. "I had a feeling you'd come," Sophie said, gesturing for Laura to sit. Laura didn't respond. She studied Sophie's every move, searching for any hint of guilt. "I'm here to understand what's going on between you and my husband." Sophie smiled faintly, as though the question didn't catch her off guard. "You and Carl have a complicated history, don't you?" "You didn't answer my question," Laura pressed, her voice growing firmer as she struggled to maintain her composure. Sophie looked Laura in the eye, seemingly weighing how honest she should be. "Carl, he's a wonderful man, but I think you already know there's something between us." Sophie's words hit Laura like a thunderclap. She clenched her fists but forced herself not to react emotionally. "What do you mean?" Laura's voice was barely audible, but tension rippled through her words. Sophie walked to the large window overlooking the pool. "We met at an exhibition. He said you were busy. We started talking, and there was chemistry between us. It was unexpected for both of us." "Did he promise you anything?" Laura couldn't believe what she was hearing. Sophie turned back to Laura, a trace of sadness in her eyes. "No, but we both know this isn't just friendship." Laura felt something inside her shatter. She wanted to scream, to cry, but she couldn't allow herself to show weakness. "I think you need to talk to Carl," Sophie added. "He needs to decide what he wants." Those words sounded like a final verdict. Laura couldn't stay in this house any longer. She stood and headed for the door. "Laura," Sophie called after her. Laura turned around. "You know, I'm not sure the problem is just me. Maybe it's about what's missing between you two." That was the last thing Laura wanted to hear. She quickly left the house without looking back. Sitting in her car, Laura couldn't calm down. Her thoughts were jumbled, and her emotions overwhelmed her. She knew the conversation with Sophie had only partially revealed the truth. It was time to put everything on the table with Carl. Laura picked up her phone and dialed Carl's number. He answered almost immediately. "Laura, is everything okay? We need to talk. I'm waiting for you at home." She hung up without waiting for a response. The conversation ahead could change their lives forever. Laura sat in the living room, arms crossed, waiting for Carl. The wait was unbearable, and every minute felt like an eternity. Her gaze wandered around the room, which had once been their cozy sanctuary but now reminded her of something lost. The door opened, and Carl entered, holding a briefcase. His eyes immediately fell on Laura, and he realized this wouldn't be an ordinary conversation. He set the briefcase down and slowly approached her. "Laura, what happened?" His voice was cautious, as if he were trying to buy time. "We need to talk," she said, trying to keep her emotions in check, though her voice trembled. "And I want to hear nothing but the truth." Carl sat across from her, taking a deep breath. His hands nervously intertwined, and his eyes avoided meeting hers. "Okay," he began after a pause. "I'll tell you everything." "Sophie," Carl took another breath. "It happened by chance. I met her at an exhibition. She was, well, an interesting conversationalist. We started talking, and over time, I realized she had become more than just an acquaintance. Laura sat silently, carefully listening to every word. Her heart ached with pain, but she continued to hold herself together. We met a few times, he continued, but it's not what you think. I never wanted to betray you, Laura. It's just that, over time, it felt like something had grown cold between us. Laura could no longer stay silent. So you decided to find what you were missing in another woman? Her voice was quiet, but the deep hurt in it was unmistakable. Carl hung his head, unsure of what to say. I never wanted it to go this far, he said. Sophie just became someone I could be different with. But I love you, Laura. Laura felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. And the bracelet? She asked, her voice cracking. You gave her my bracelet, Carl. Carl lifted his head, his face showing confusion. What? I didn't give her the bracelet, he said. How could she have it? Laura stood, walked around the room, and looked at him. I have a photo. She's wearing the bracelet I gave you. Don't tell me you didn't know. Carl shot to his feet, his expression troubled. Laura, I swear, I didn't give her the bracelet. Silence filled the air, but then Laura's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and saw a message from Sophie. It contained only one sentence. Do you really want to know the whole truth? Laura held her breath, but, without saying a word, showed Carl the message. He went pale. What does this mean? She asked, staring at him. Carl didn't answer. He looked as if he had seen a ghost. Laura decided not to delay. She could no longer live in uncertainty, and Sophie's cryptic message only heightened her determination to uncover the truth. She wrote back to Sophie, I want to know the whole truth. Can we meet? The reply came almost instantly. Tomorrow at 3. You know where to find me. Laura didn't sleep all night, contemplating all the possible outcomes. She tried to prepare herself for anything, but felt that even the worst scenario she could imagine wouldn't compare to reality. The next day, Laura arrived at Sophie's estate. This time, the door was open, and Sophie was waiting for her in the spacious living room, holding a glass of white wine. You made up your mind quickly, Sophie said, sitting on a couch and gesturing for Laura to do the same. I didn't have a choice, Laura replied, ignoring the invitation to sit. Her tone was cold. So, you want to know the truth? Sophie asked, raising the glass to her lips. I want to know what's going on between you and Carl, and why you're sending me these messages. Sophie took a sip and looked at Laura. Her face remained emotionless, but there was a spark of intrigue in her eyes. All right, she said, placing the glass on the table. Let's start from the beginning. Sophie explained that she met Carl at an exhibition organized by Alex. They started talking, and Carl confided in her about certain problems in his marriage with Laura. At first, their relationship was purely friendly, but over time, they grew closer. He wasn't happy, Laura, Sophie said, her voice quiet but firm. He felt like he had lost himself in your relationship, and you decided to be the one to find him? Laura couldn't hold back her sarcasm. Sophie raised her eyes, and a faint smile played on her lips. It wasn't that simple. Carl, he was desperate. I didn't force him to do anything. Laura began pacing the room nervously, trying to process what she'd heard. And the bracelet? She asked sharply. Sophie sighed. He left it here accidentally when he came by a few weeks ago. I thought it might get your attention. Laura froze. You planned all of this on purpose? Her voice was filled with outrage. Sophie stepped closer, her tone sharp. And do you really think Carl is so innocent? Do you think I'm the only problem in your marriage? Laura stared at Sophie, trying to discern whether she was telling the truth or simply trying to ruin her life. If you want to know, Sophie continued, Carl hasn't told you everything. There's something else you need to know. Laura clenched her fists. What is it? Her voice was cracking. Sophie looked at her challengingly but didn't answer. Instead, she picked up her phone and typed something. Moments later, Laura received a new message. She opened it and saw a photo of Carl, but not with Sophie. He was with another woman. Laura's heart sank, and it felt as though the ground had fallen out from under her feet. Laura drove home, clutching her phone so tightly her fingers turned white. Her heart raced, and emotions surged one after another. Anger, pain, confusion. The photo Sophie had sent left no room for doubt. In it, Carl was in the arms of an unfamiliar woman, and their closeness was clearly more than friendly. When she entered the house, Carl was sitting in the living room. His expression changed immediately when he saw the look in her eyes. Laura threw her phone onto the table, the screen illuminated by the photo. "What is this, Carl?" Her voice was cold, but it carried an unmistakable note of pain. Carl picked up the phone, saw the image, and froze. His face turned pale, and his eyes darted around as though searching for the right words. "Laura, it's not what you think," he began, but his voice was uncertain. "Then tell me what it is," she said, her voice rising, tears shimmering in her eyes. Carl nervously ran a hand through his hair and sat on the couch, lowering his head. "It's Emily," he finally said. "And who is Emily?" Laura crossed her arms, trying to hold back her anger. She's my colleague. We met at a few events. She was helping me with a project, and somehow," he hesitated, "somehow it went a bit further than it should have." Laura stood there, disbelief washing over her. "A bit further? Are you joking, Carl? You already have Sophie, and now Emily? Who's next?" Carl raised his head, his eyes filled with despair. "I know it sounds terrible, but I never meant for this to happen. It didn't mean anything, Laura." "Didn't mean anything?" Laura laughed, but her laughter was filled with pain. "Do you even realize how this looks to me?" Carl tried to step closer to her, but she took a step back. "Laura, I'm sorry. I made mistakes, but I never stopped loving you." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Love? If this is your idea of love, Carl, then I don't know what we've been doing all these years." Carl's face crumpled with regret, but Laura couldn't bear to look at him any longer. "This isn't about Emily, or Sophie, or anyone else," she said, her voice breaking. "It's about trust, and you've shattered it." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Carl alone, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a storm he couldn't escape. "I love you, Laura," Carl said. "These were mistakes. They meant nothing." Laura looked at him, and for a moment, it seemed like he was being sincere. But her intuition told her Carl was hiding something. "If they meant nothing, why didn't you tell me about them earlier? Why did I have to find out through photos?" Carl was silent for a moment, then sighed. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of losing you." The words sounded like an excuse, but they only heightened her suspicions. "And why did Sophie send me that photo? Does she just want to destroy us? Or is there more to it?" Carl hesitated, and Laura noticed. "Answer me, Carl. What else are you hiding?" Carl lifted his head, and there was an expression in his eyes that Laura had never seen before. "There's something I need to tell you," he finally said. Laura froze, sensing that she was about to hear something that could change everything. "Sophie and Emily are connected. They—" Carl didn't finish because Laura's phone rang. Sophie's name appeared on the screen again. Laura picked up the phone and stayed silent. On the other end, a cold, calm voice responded. "Laura, if you want to save your marriage, you need to meet me tomorrow. Otherwise, you'll never know the truth." Carl insisted, his voice firm, his expression resolute. "Laura, this time I'm going with you. Sophie is playing some game, and I won't let her drive us further apart." Laura hesitated. She understood that this meeting could be explosive. Her trust in Carl was shattered, but at the same time, she felt his presence might help uncover the truth. "Fine," she finally said, exhaling deeply. "But you have to stay quiet until I'm done. This is my conversation." Carl nodded, but it was clear that staying silent would be a challenge for him. The next day, they arrived at Sophie's estate together. The gates opened, and the couple entered the house. Sophie was waiting for them in the living room. Her face was calm, but her eyes sparkled with some hidden joy. Well, what a surprise," she said upon seeing Carl. "I wasn't expecting to see you both." "I'm here to make sure you don't manipulate my wife any further," Carl said sharply. Sophie smiled. "Manipulate? Oh, Carl, you've done everything yourself to make this happen." Laura gestured for Carl to stop as he was about to respond. Sophie, enough games. I want to know the truth. What's between you and Carl? And how does Emily fit into this? Sophie took a step toward the window, looked outside, and began to speak. Carl was intriguing. He drew attention with his charisma, his confidence. But the most interesting part was how he talked about you, Laura. Laura frowned. What do you mean? Sophie turned, her face now serious. He always talked about your flaws, about how you'd become cold, how you focused on your career and forgot about him. Laura felt her heart tighten. She looked at Carl, but he said nothing. And then I came along, Sophie continued. I was his escape, his way to feel important. That's not true, Carl said abruptly. Sophie smiled again, her calm demeanor taking on a sinister edge. The truth, Carl? Then tell her about the deal with Emily. Laura felt her body tense. Deal? Her voice was quiet, but resolute. Carl averted his gaze, struggling to find the words. Laura, this was for business. Emily is the daughter of an influential figure, and I thought it would help us. Help us? Laura's voice trembled. You risked our marriage for a deal? Carl reached out to her, but Laura stepped back. It's not what it seems, he insisted. I wanted to fix everything. Sophie took a step forward. Oh, he certainly fixed something, she said with irony. But are you ready to hear what exactly? It felt like everything around Laura froze. What do you mean? Sophie pulled an envelope from her bag and handed it to Laura. Open it and see for yourself. Laura took the envelope, her hands trembling. She opened it and found documents that made her blood run cold. She held the documents in her hands, her eyes darting across the text. What she read seemed unreal. It was a collection of financial reports, contracts, and correspondence that outlined a complex scheme involving Carl and Emily. What is this? Her voice was calm, but it betrayed the inner breaking she was experiencing. Carl stayed silent, his face a mix of shock and shame. Carl, I'm asking you, what is this? Laura repeated, her voice rising. It's part of the business, he finally said, but his voice was weak. Part of the business? Laura couldn't believe her ears. You call this business? This is financial fraud. This is a crime. Sophie, standing slightly to the side, observed their conversation with satisfaction, but also with an unsettling ease. I thought you deserved to know the truth, Laura, she said. Carl and Emily have created a scheme that not only jeopardizes their careers, but could also affect your reputation. Laura turned to Carl, her eyes filled with anger and disappointment. How could this affect me? She asked, directing her question more towards Sophie than Carl. Sophie nodded at the documents. Your name is in there, she replied. You're listed in several agreements as a co-owner of Carl's business. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Laura looked at the documents again and saw her name in the headers of the contracts. You set me up, Carl? Her voice was shaky but filled with fury. Laura, I didn't mean to, Carl began. It was necessary for the deal. They wouldn't sign the contracts without your name in them. You didn't even ask me. Laura yelled, her voice filled with pain. How could you do this without my permission? I'll fix everything, Carl said, stepping closer to her. I swear, it will all be fine. Laura stepped back. Fine? Do you even realize what you've done? If this comes out, I'll lose everything. My reputation, my career. Sophie took a few steps forward, her face serious. Laura, she said, Carl didn't just risk your name. There's more to these deals. Laura looked at her. What exactly? Sophie paused for a moment, then continued. Emily has been planning to take you out of the picture for a long time. She needed your name to secure the deals. Now that everything is in place, she can use it against you. Carl interrupted. That's not true, he said. Emily wouldn't do something like that. Sophie laughed, her laughter cold and bitter. Do you really think so? Then why has she already started? Laura felt her insides tighten. What do you mean? She asked, her voice quiet but resolute. Sophie pulled out her phone and showed her an email. It was a message from Emily to one of the partners, discussing the possibility of holding Laura accountable if the deal fell through. She's preparing to set you up, Laura, Sophie said. And if you don't act, it will destroy you. Laura stared at the phone screen, unsure of what to say. Her world was beginning to crumble. Laura stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the phone screen Sophie was holding. Her mind raced with hundreds of thoughts, but none provided answers to the most pressing question. How had her life become so entangled? "What do you want from me?" Her voice was tense, but she tried to appear strong. Sophie smiled, a smile that emphasized her power in this situation. "Laura, it's simple. I'll help you clear your name and destroy Emily's plans. But I have one condition." "What is it?" Laura asked cautiously, trying not to show fear. Sophie took a step closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You leave Carl." Laura felt her heart stop. "What?" she whispered. "You heard me," Sophie replied. "You leave him. Forget he was ever part of your life." Carl, who had been silent until now, suddenly burst out. "You're insane, Sophie. You have no right to dictate such terms." Sophie gave him a contemptuous look. "Oh, Carl, I have more rights than you think. Who do you think convinced Emily to involve Laura in these deals?" The words hit Laura like a thunderclap. "It was you?" Her voice was almost inaudible, but disbelief resonated in it. "Yes," Sophie replied, not breaking eye contact. "But it was necessary. Emily wanted to destroy you, Laura. I knew that by pulling you into this business, at least you'd know what was happening." "You call that helping?" Laura could no longer hold back. Her voice rose, and her eyes filled with tears. "You've ruined everything I had." Sophie remained unfazed. "And now I'm offering you a chance to fix it. But the price is Carl." Carl stepped closer to Laura, his face pale. "Laura, don't listen to her. We can find another way." "Can we, Carl?" Laura turned to him, her gaze piercing. "You dragged me into this without my knowledge. You put me in harm's way." Carl couldn't respond. His silence said more than words. "You have time to think," Sophie said, "but not much. Emily has already started moving, and if you want to save your reputation, you'll have to accept my offer." Laura felt her world collapsing. She knew the decision she had to make would change everything. "You know where to find me when you decide," Sophie added before leaving the room, leaving Laura and Carl alone. Laura sat in the living room at home. Carl was nearby, but an invisible wall had formed between them. "What are you going to do?" he finally asked. "I don't know," Laura replied without looking at him. Her phone buzzed again. It was Sophie. Laura didn't answer, but her fingers gripped the phone so tightly it almost slipped from her hand. "We'll figure this out together," Carl said. "We'll find a way." Laura raised her eyes to him. "Is there anything else I should know, Carl? What else have you been hiding from me?" Carl held his breath for a moment, as if deciding whether to confess. "There's one thing." At that moment, the door swung open, and Emily stood on the threshold. Her face radiated confidence, and her voice rang out as if she had already won. "Laura, it's time to talk." Laura stood by the door, staring at Emily. This woman exuded assurance, her gaze direct, and her thin smile suggested she held all the cards. Carl stood behind Laura, silently observing, but his tense posture betrayed his fear. "We need to talk, Laura," Emily said, her voice calm but each word sharp as a blade. "What do you want?" Laura asked, holding the door open but not inviting her in. Emily chuckled lightly. "Oh, I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. Trust me, this concerns not just Carl, but your friendly acquaintance Sophie as well." Laura hesitated for a moment, then stepped back, allowing Emily to enter. They sat in the living room. Carl kept to the side, but his presence filled the room with tension. Laura stared directly at Emily, trying to determine if this was another game. "All right, say what you need to say," Laura said. Emily set her handbag aside and began. "Carl has only told you half the truth, if he's told you anything at all. But I'm not here to justify him or anyone else. I'm here to explain why things have escalated to this point." "I'm listening," Laura said, folding her arms and trying to keep her composure. Emily nodded, her voice softening, almost friendly. "At first, I thought Carl was just a con man trying to drag me into his business, but then Sophie appeared. She's not just an artist. She's a manipulator." Laura tensed. "What do you mean?" "She used Carl," Emily explained. She knew he was desperate because of your relationship and offered him a lucrative deal. But it was just bait. Laura leaned forward. Bait for what? To pull you in, Emily continued. Sophie knew you would be the perfect target. She used your name in the documents to access deals she could never secure on her own. That doesn't make sense, Laura replied. Why would she do that? Emily paused, as if choosing her words carefully. Because she wanted more than just money. She wanted Carl. Laura felt her blood boil. She said they were just friends. Emily laughed. She's lying. Her goal is to destroy your marriage, make Carl hers, and use him to achieve her own ambitions. And you? Laura asked sharply. What role are you playing in this? Emily sighed. My mistake was trusting both of them. I thought Carl was honest, but he deceived me too. Sophie orchestrated all of this to drag us into this mess. Laura turned to Carl. Is this true? Carl exhaled heavily, but his eyes avoided hers. Laura, I didn't want it to go this far. Sophie said it was just a deal. She assured me it wouldn't affect you. Laura rose from her seat, her hands trembling with anger. Wouldn't affect me? You dragged me into criminal schemes, Carl. Emily stood up after her. I'm here to help, Emily said. I have evidence that can save your reputation and destroy Sophie. But you have to decide if you trust me. Why should I trust you? Laura asked. Emily stepped closer, her face growing serious. Because I want Sophie to pay for everything she's done, and you're the only one who can help me. Laura hesitated. Her heart told her one thing, but her mind screamed danger. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Laura turned, confusion written on her face. Are you expecting someone? Emily asked. Laura walked to the door and opened it. Standing there was Sophie, her smile as cold as ever. Hope I'm not interrupting your little meeting, Sophie said as she stepped in without an invitation. Sophie strode confidently into the room, her heels clicking against the wooden floor in a rhythmic beat. Her cold, piercing gaze swept over Laura and settled on Emily. It was immediately clear that Sophie was ready for a fight. Oh, how interesting, Sophie said, crossing her arms. Emily, I didn't know you decided to switch sides. Emily turned to Sophie, her smile equally sharp. I was never on your side, Sophie. You used me, just like you've used everyone else. Now it's time to end your games. Sophie laughed, her laugh cold and tense. Used you? You came to me, remember? We both knew exactly what we were getting into. Laura stood between them, feeling the tension in the room grow. Her hands trembled, and her heart pounded wildly. What's going on here? She demanded. You both dragged me into this, and I want to know why. Sophie turned to Laura, her tone softening but remaining just as threatening. Laura, you were just a convenient target. Your husband did everything he could to pull you into this game. That's not true. Emily interrupted. Carl is just as much a victim of your manipulations, Sophie. Sophie smiled again, her calm demeanor almost mocking. And you thought you'd come out of this clean? She sneered. Emily, you're just as guilty as I am. But I'm not hiding behind others, Emily shot back. I'm ready to take responsibility for my actions. Unlike you, Sophie, who only destroys the lives of others. Sophie stepped closer, her face inches from Emily's. The difference between us is that I always win, she whispered. Emily didn't back down. Not this time. Laura tried to intervene, but Sophie raised her hand sharply, stopping her. Stay out of this, Laura, Sophie said. This isn't your war. Not my war. Laura exploded. You've both destroyed my life, and now you're telling me it's not my war? Sophie sighed, as if bored with the conversation. Laura, you don't even understand what you've been dragged into. At that moment, Emily stepped closer to Laura, placing a hand on her shoulder. Don't listen to her, Emily said. Sophie always preys on weaknesses. But now we have a chance to end this. Laura looked at Emily, trying to determine if she could be trusted. Her heart felt like it was being torn apart. How can I trust either of you? She asked, her voice quiet but filled with pain. Trust yourself, Emily replied. I'll help you destroy Sophie, but you'll have to make a choice. A choice? Laura repeated. What choice? Emily fell silent, but her gaze said more than words ever could. "Decide who your enemy is, Laura," Sophie interjected. "But remember, even those who seem like allies can betray you." At that moment, the door opened again. Carl stood in the doorway, his face a mix of confusion and fear. "What's going on here?" he asked. Sophie and Emily both turned to him simultaneously. The tension in the room reached its peak. "It's time to make a decision, Laura," Sophie said. "You're either with me or against me," Emily added. Laura looked at the three people in front of her, feeling as though her world was finally falling apart. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered, but no one answered. Laura felt the air in the room grow heavier. Three pairs of eyes were fixed on her. Carl looked terrified, Sophie hid her intentions behind a calm expression, and Emily seemed ready to make her next move. "You all thought I'd stay silent, but that was your biggest mistake," Laura said, her voice sharp. "This time, we play by my rules." Sophie smirked slightly, her eyes gleaming with sarcasm. "And what are your rules, Laura?" Laura pulled out her phone, tapped a few buttons, and raised it for everyone to see. "I recorded our conversations, Sophie, and all your admissions are now saved here." Sophie remained composed, but her gaze turned colder. "Interesting," she replied. "But recordings mean nothing without evidence to back them up. And what if I told you I have access to your financial documents?" Laura continued, her voice growing more confident. Carl's eyes widened. "Laura, what are you doing?" "What you couldn't do, Carl, getting us all out of this mess," she replied without even looking at him. The next few minutes felt like a chess match. Laura took the initiative again, forcing Emily to admit that her role in Sophie's schemes was far deeper than she had previously claimed. "You're not as innocent as you want to appear," Laura said, showing another file she had obtained from a legal contact. "Here are your signatures on the agreements you tried to hide." Emily flushed, but quickly composed herself. "And what does that prove?" "Sophie is behind all of this. I was just following orders." Sophie responded instantly. "Don't make me laugh, Emily. You always knew exactly what you were doing." Carl, who had been silently watching, tried to intervene. "We can resolve this without making a scene. Let's all calm down." Laura turned to him, her gaze filled with anger. "Calm down? You dragged me into this without my consent, and now you want me to just sit back and stay quiet?" Carl lowered his head, unable to respond. Laura knew it was time to make her final move. She stood and looked at all three of them. "Here's what's going to happen," she began. "I'll hand all these materials over to the press unless you all stop your games immediately." Sophie smiled, but her eyes flashed with anger. "And what will that get you, Laura? Do you think you'll walk away from this unscathed?" "Maybe I won't," Laura replied, her voice firm, "but I won't let you use me anymore." Emily tried to protest. "Laura, you're making a mistake. We can work together." Laura shot her a look that silenced her instantly. "Work together? You mean let you manipulate me again?" "No, thank you." Suddenly, there was another knock at the door. Everyone turned their heads. "Who else did you invite?" Sophie asked coldly. Laura raised her hand to silence them and opened the door. Standing there was someone no one expected to see. Laura stood by the window, gazing at the horizon as the twilight slowly swallowed the sky. Her mind raced with dozens of thoughts, each a fragment of a new plan. She realized she could no longer trust anyone. Not Carl, not Sophie, not Emily. They were all playing their own games, each move calculated to gain an advantage at her expense. "Enough," she whispered to herself. Her decision was clear. She would no longer be a pawn in anyone else's hands. Laura decided to take matters into her own hands, even if it meant risking everything. That night, she gathered all the documents she had, including the recordings of her conversations with Sophie and Emily. Her first stop was a journalist she knew who worked for a major publication. "This is risky, Laura," he said, reviewing the materials. "If you release this, the consequences could be unpredictable." "I'm ready for the consequences," she replied firmly, "but I won't let them use me anymore." After the meeting, Laura decided to go further. She arranged a meeting with a lawyer to understand how to protect herself if any of them decided to retaliate. "Sophie and Emily are dangerous opponents," the lawyer said. "They might try to discredit you before you can prove your case. What do you suggest? Laura asked. Find each of their weak spots and use it against them, the lawyer replied. Laura nodded. She knew she needed more information and had an idea of how to get it. The next day, she returned to Sophie. Their meeting was tense, but Laura kept her composure. I have a proposition, she began. Sophie raised an eyebrow. And what might that be? I'll keep everything I have to myself if you help me take down Emily, Laura said. Sophie laughed, but interest flickered in her eyes. And why should I trust you? Because you know I can hurt you too, Laura replied. But I don't want a war with you. Sophie considered this for a moment. Fine, she finally said. But you should understand this will be dangerous. Laura nodded. She was already prepared to take the risk. However, her plan began to unravel almost immediately. The next day, Laura received a message from an unknown number. I know what you're planning. You think you can win, but you're wrong. Stop before it's too late. Laura felt her heart tighten. She realized someone was watching her every move. That evening, as Laura sat in her apartment, there was a knock at the door. She approached, but no one answered. When she opened the door, she found an envelope on the floor. Inside was a photo. She and Sophie during their last meeting, taken from a distance. On the back was a note. You're playing with fire. Next time, you'll get burned. Laura walked home under the cold night sky. Her thoughts were chaotic, and her heart heavy. All this time, she had fought to uncover the truth, but with every step, that truth became more tangled and painful. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Carl sat in the living room, his posture tense, his face weary. He stood up as Laura entered, but she didn't let him speak. You need to answer me, she said, her voice icy. Answer what? Carl asked, his voice low, almost resigned. Is it true that you went back to Sophie? Carl froze. He looked at Laura but said nothing. His silence was worse than any words. I'm waiting for an answer, she insisted, her voice trembling. Laura, I never meant to betray you. But Sophie, she was part of something I couldn't control. What does that mean? Laura stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. Carl sighed and finally spoke. Sophie blackmailed me. She knew about our financial troubles and offered her help, but in return, she demanded much more than I could give. And you agreed? Laura asked, her voice breaking with disappointment. I thought I could manage it. But Sophie knows how to play the game, Carl admitted. Laura laughed, but there was no joy in her laughter. Play the game? That's your explanation? You let her destroy our marriage just to fix your problems? Carl tried to step closer, but she stepped back. Laura, I still love you. Love? Her voice was full of bitterness. You betrayed me not just physically, but morally. You took away my right to know the truth. Carl fell silent. He realized there was nothing more he could say to change the situation. Laura approached the table where all the documents, recordings, and evidence she had gathered were laid out. She looked at them, then turned back to Carl. I'm leaving, Carl. This is no longer my life. Laura, please, he began, but her gaze silenced him. She packed her things and left the apartment. This time, her heart was heavy, but she felt a sense of relief. She had finally made a decision that gave her freedom. Outside, the air was cold, but for the first time in a long while, Laura felt like she could breathe. She knew her journey to uncover the truth was over. And though it had been a difficult ending, she understood that everything now depended solely on her. What would you have done in Laura's place? Stayed to fight for the relationship or chosen freedom?